The new creation ultimately is a new body, just not immediately. So the new creation, we don't suddenly go to heaven. Even though we say we're a new creation here, we don't suddenly transform into our spiritual, immortal body, but we do get a different body. So all of that is linked together, even though it doesn't occur in a bam, bam, bam type sequence. It all certainly has an interrelationship, just as I would say the physical death and the spiritual death has an interrelationship as well. You may not die physically at the moment you die spiritually, because Adam and Eve, when they ate of the apple, they didn't just suddenly drop down dead. But I think the Bible very clearly suggests that that process began. Would they not have died, or would they have died anyway otherwise?
I'd say I don't know what would have happened otherwise. We can't do the control.
I understand. I totally understand that. The problem I have with that then is that's essentially saying that where would we be if they hadn't sinned? Would we just be stuck in the garden, die, and there would, because there'd be no redemption? Where would we be?
It's a great question.
See, and that's the problem. That's one of the problems I have. I don't know how to fit that in your evolutionary idea. I don't know where to place that. Okay, another question then.
And maybe where we'd be is beautiful relationships with God continuing, and close communion with God, just like Adam and Eve had. And still generations and people physically dying and going on to eternal life with God, because there was no spiritual death in the meantime. I don't know. I'm just saying that would be compatible with, I think, a picture of God's creation.
So, in your understanding, when God created, as in Genesis 1, let's create man in our own image, then what did that mean? Create man in our own image?
Yeah, so that's partly why I drew the analogy with the development of a baby. Would you agree that scientific explanation is pretty clear on the steps in development of a baby, that there's no need to invoke supernatural intervention?
I would agree, except I would interject one thing. What was the origin of it?
You mean many generations ago?
Where did that process initially come from?
Right, so but it's a different question. But once we have a sperm and an egg in a couple today.
Clearly the creation model says, yes, God set up processes, just like gravity. Yeah, it doesn't say that God has to miraculously intervene to make sure that, I keep a little hair I still have on my head, although I wish I would. Okay, but it clearly, the creation model clearly says, though, that to account for origin. We go back. Where did that come from? That process that started.
Right.
So, okay, back to the question then.
Right.
God created man in his own image. Okay, how does that
fit?
In the
evolutionary picture, how does that look?
Well, in your evolution, I'm not trying to straddle you with like Eugenie Scott's evolution. I'm trying, okay, your evolutionary picture.
And so, the analogy of the baby is very clear that sperm and egg are not in God's image. But somewhere along the line, God does a spiritual work. Would you agree that that baby becomes in God's image? Because I'm going to draw that over, so I want to know if you agree with that.
You're talking about the sperm and the egg separately?
Right.
Okay.
Do they have a soul or a spirit already? The egg, the 3 million eggs in a woman's uterus?
Okay, right. It's when they become the zygote that they become the information.
God does something special.
Right. The information to make it human is now there.
And it's not even a physical step, you think, but maybe God does something special, spiritually.
To instill with the spiritual, clearly.
Where there's a half a soul and a half a soul, and it gets confusing.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't have I haven't thought, tremendously about it, but C.S. Lewis, Billy Graham, both C.S. Lewis has a beautiful description of what that might have looked like. But the idea is, so people evolved from monkeys, and so different types of simians, and then there was a transition. And as you say in your talk, humans have always been humans. And I think evolution says that too. Once humans became humans, they were always humans.
Once humans became humans?
Once humans appeared in the fossil record, then from then on, they were humans. But I'm going to answer your question first.
Okay.
But if there's a process, a sperm and an egg can be touched by God and become then in the image of God, then there could be a process where somewhere God touched and decided, this is now man in my image. I just want to read what C.S. Lewis wrote. For long centuries, God perfected the animal form which was to become the vehicle of humanity and image of himself. The creature may have existed in the state for ages before it became man. It may have even been clever enough to make things which a modern archaeologist would accept as proof of its humanity. But it was only an animal because all its physical and psychical processes were directed to purely material and natural ends. Then in the fullness of time, God caused to descend on this organism a new kind of consciousness which could say, I and me, which could look upon itself as an object which knew God, which could make judgments of truth, beauty, and goodness, and which was so far above time it could perceive time flowing fast. We do not know how many of these God made or how long they continued in paradise. And he goes on. But so the idea is, yeah, there is a natural process of evolution that God is involved in, as he's involved in everything. And at some point in that process, he decided, now this is man in my image. And he then, just like a newborn baby is made special, God makes that man special.
And it was just Adam and Eve? So it was just two of them?
And so C.S. Lewis says we don't know how many, but there was a beginning of humanity.
So there would have been more than Adam and Eve?
So I don't know. It could have been one, could have been more than one, but one makes a lot of sense.
But the Bible declares that Eve's the mother of
all of humanity.
Right.
Yeah. And doesn't Adam just mean humanity? I mean,
Well,
it's not really the name of a person. It's the same word as humanity.
I think that, though, many times what we find in ancient Hebrew is the contemporary definitions kind of get applied later on, where that didn't necessarily mean that was the meaning of them at the time, but we have later on said, well, this is certainly how it fits, and so we kind of, at retrospect, applied definitions back. So I think sometimes we have to be a little bit careful to say, well, that's what it meant at that time.
But it's the same Hebrew word that's used many other places.
Correct, right, yeah. But see, then again, okay, so we're looking at, I have children, and God instills into them a spirit, so they're not human, but I'm not.
So some pre-human had children that God touched and became human.
So how were they made from, how was Adam and Eve made from the dust of the ground?
So that would definitely be a picture, just like sperm and egg are really dust of the ground. If we go from ashes to ashes, to dust to dust. You and I are dust.
Exactly.
We came from dust and we're going to dust.
I totally agree with that.
And so again, I think of that as the spiritual truths are being the important part of that text. And exactly how it worked, I don't know, but it's a text that has to communicate to people from 4,000 years ago all the way to today. And so if the physical reality is as science paints it, then...
yeah, I would say
you disagree,
science
right?
Paint it, right, yeah. So, okay,
and so I have a lot of openness and mystery to take really the spiritual truth from there and give God a lot of freedom.
Well, let's pick up on a comment you just made a moment ago, though, saying God is involved in the process all along. How do you see that? What's God's involvement in this evolutionary process?
So, what's God's involvement in you getting out of bed in the morning?
You tell me. I mean, that's...
Well, I'm asking you, in your faith, what would that be? Do you see God as important for that?
Well, I would see God as important because I believe that, everything that exists, God is holding together, clearly.
And exactly, and that's my view of God's involvement in evolution.
Okay, so evolution is a process then that God has to constantly direct, or it's more like us getting out of bed in the morning, he just set it in motion, it just kind of goes.
Yeah, so it's exactly with that same ambiguity that I would answer the question. Free will versus God predestining us to do things, and how it all works is definitely beyond me, but I picture that God is involved in that. And so does he direct me to, we go and we meet somebody in the store, right, and you say, hey, this is a God thing, right? He brought us together. And so the timing is just so important, and we don't know exactly how it works or doesn't work. But so how does mutations work? God definitely set up physical laws and processes, just like we can do fertilization in a test tube, right? And is God still involved in that? Yes, he's sustaining it all. But the physical laws and processes seem to be the way God normally works in the world. that He set things in place, and most things go according to these physical laws and processes. Otherwise, science wouldn't work at all, right? If there were interventions all the time, science would be...
It amuses me with some of our non-Christian colleagues. The very basis of science is dependent upon everything being ordered and structured from, by their definition or their understanding, a non-ordered, non-structured origin. So I've always been amused by that. They're dependent upon a Christian view of God holding things together to be able to even do science. Okay, but let's follow up on that just a second. As a scientist, Christian, who is saying that evolution is the scientifically valid position, okay, but saying that God has an involvement, and yet we're struggling here to really see where God's involvement is, then clearly you would recognize that a lot of people use evolution, to justify their non-belief in God.
Yes.
Exactly.
They use it to justify their non-belief.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm not saying you agree with this, but I am saying that it creates a situation where evolution, the scientific version of evolution, we come back to that, the scientific version of evolution, where does your view fit into the scientific view of evolution? Your God of this, constantly involved, constantly watching, constantly overseeing evolution is clearly not there scientifically.
My view looks just the same as theirs.
Okay.
When it comes to doing science, a Christian or a non-Christian, in my view, does the same experiments.
If I am a non-believer, then I can very easily step up and say, well, then I don't see your God.
Exactly.
Then how does that fit with the very scripture you quoted, Psalms 19? The heavens declare the glory of God. And in fact, I would go on to quote it further. It says there's no language, there's no place on earth. And I would say that's also the scientific textbooks and the scientific laboratory that does not declare the glory of God. So if we're looking